On the afternoon of June 29, 2018, a 44-year-old woman named Dawn Sturgis sat on a blanket in a park in Salisbury, England, drinking some wine with a few friends and her boyfriend Charlie Rowley. It was Dawn's favorite way to spend a Friday, especially since it involved Charlie. So they'd been dating for 16 months, and she was completely in love with him, primarily because Charlie was truly like the lone bright spot in Dawn's otherwise really difficult life. So Dawn was an alcoholic who had struggled with an undiagnosed case of bipolar disorder for years. And so she had a hard time finding work. And for the last 2 years, she'd actually lived in a therapeutic group home. But it was a little after she had moved in there that she had very fortunately met Charlie. Now, on paper, Dawn and Charlie did not seem like they would be good for each other. Charlie was addicted to heroin. He also didn't have a job, and he was frequently in trouble with the law. And so when they first got together, people in Dawn's life worried that Charlie ultimately was just going to pull her down even further into her own problems. But they did make each other really happy, and so they spent basically all of their time together, going between each other's apartments and visiting the park and hanging out with their friends. And for Dawn, this taste of happiness had made her want to make some positive changes in her life. Now, she still drank alcohol, but she finally got her bipolar disorder diagnosed and properly medicated. And she was feeling stable for the first time in years. She was even planning to move out of that group home and into a new apartment soon, and hoped that, that would give her a chance for a true fresh start. And because of all these changes, Dawn had planned a get-together with her family to show them how well she was doing. It was in a few days, and she'd really wanted Charlie to come with her, since their relationship, at least in her mind, was a huge reason she'd been so motivated to turn this corner. Except, despite how much she adored Charlie and really was excited for her life with him, at the current moment as they sat in the park on this Friday, she actually was really mad at him. So before arriving at the park, Charlie and their friends had done some heroin and some other drugs, and being under the influence of these substances was making Charlie act like a total jerk. Dawn had just bought some new hair dye to give herself a new look for this get-together with her family. And now Charlie, high on drugs, was wasting it by putting it in his beard and his eyebrows as a joke. And so Dawn ultimately was really mad, not so much because he was wasting the dye, but because by dyeing your beard and eyebrows and all that Charlie was going to look like a total deranged mess when he met her family for the first time in a few days. And so when she expressed her concerns to Charlie, he did go and, wash out the dye from his face, and he got most of it out. But even after, Dawn still felt just so annoyed by the whole thing. It's like he knew how important this meeting with her family was going to be. Why would you jeopardize that? And so in the end, even after he had cleaned himself up, Dawn just got up and stormed off, leaving Charlie and the friends to pack everything up. She was done. Hours later, around 10 p.m. that night, Dawn lay on the couch in Charlie's living room, listening to Charlie and their friend Sam Hobson talk about life and how unpredictable and how unfair it could be. Now, Dawn was still feeling annoyed at Charlie, but overall, she was mostly back to being in a pretty good mood. After she had stormed away from the park, she'd gone to her place, and she had dyed her hair with the rest of the dye that was left, and then she'd called her mom. Dawn actually had 3 kids of her own, and 2 of them were adults. But her own mother, so Dawn's mother, had custody of the youngest child, and Dawn was hoping that maybe they could all see each other tomorrow at this get-together. And her mother had said yes, so Dawn was really looking forward to that. But at this exact moment, all Dawn really wanted to do was just go to sleep. So she got up off the couch to go grab her nightly medication out of the bathroom, and just to get there, she had to carefully step around all the junk and just sort of random items that were laying strewn about all over Charlie's apartment. Charlie was always going out and finding things out on the street or even in dumpsters and bringing those things back home. Sometimes he would sell these things afterwards, but a lot of the things he just sort of kept around. So the apartment was very cluttered. But Dawn successfully navigated the pathway to the bathroom. She grabbed her pills and then went back to the couch, swallowed the medication, and then she lay back into the cushions. Then minutes later, she was asleep. The next morning, Dawn woke up on Charlie's couch a little bit before 9:30 a.m. She did have a small hangover, just a little headache, but by her standards, that was not so bad. She had not drank a ton the day before, so this was a good start to her day. Just a few minutes later, Charlie came into the room and He sat on the couch next to her and said good morning. And between Dawn not feeling that great physically and remembering how obnoxious Charlie had been yesterday with the hair dye, Dawn really didn't feel like talking to him right now. But before she could say as much, Charlie's eyes lit up and he said he'd almost forgotten. He actually had a present for her that he'd gotten a few days ago. And then Charlie, he jumped up and he disappeared into the kitchen, and then he came back with a box, which he said was for her. It was her gift. And this made Dawn forget all about her irritation with him. Dawn didn't get very many gifts. I mean, she had a lot of friends in her life who, wanted to give her gifts, but, they, much like her and Charlie, didn't have much money. And so gifts were not a common thing in her life. And so to be receiving this gift right now was really exciting. And so Dawn smiled widely and she opened up the box's lid, and inside was this clearly very expensive bottle of perfume. And she gasped when she saw it. It was brand new. She would never have been able to afford something like this, and she was shocked, frankly, that Charlie had managed to get it for her. Like, how could he have gotten this? Dawn gave Charlie a very excited hug, and she told him she absolutely loved it. And so she pulled it out and she sprayed some on her wrists and she rubbed them together and she thought it smelled so good. And then she handed the bottle to Charlie and told him to please put this somewhere safe. Then she stood up from the couch with a big smile on her face and she went to get her makeup to go get ready for the day. About 5 minutes later, Dawn was sitting back on the couch with her makeup bag now in her lap, and she was applying foundation to her face and telling Charlie about how she was thinking about putting more dye in her hair, maybe a blue streak this time. But as she finished her foundation and reached for her powder, she felt her headache suddenly intensify. She winced, hoping it would pass, but pretty soon she started feeling pretty lightheaded and realized she was sweating quite a bit. She stopped talking about her hair and told Charlie she was feeling really weird. Charlie seemed worried and asked if she wanted some pain relievers, but Dawn just shook her head. She'd already taken her meds that day and didn't want to take more pills because it could upset her stomach. Instead, she handed her makeup bag to Charlie and asked him to go put it back in the bedroom, and then she hurried to the bathroom to splash some water on her face. And by the time she got in there and actually began putting the water on her face, it was like her whole body felt like it was on fire. She was sweating so much, to the point where she felt like this water wasn't enough. And so she actually just climbed into the empty bathtub and just figured the cold tile of the tub would feel good against her hot skin. But as soon as she climbed in and laid down, she felt her breath start to catch in her chest. From the living room, Charlie heard Dawn in the bathroom, and he heard the sound of the water turning on and then off, and then the sound of Dawn rustling around in there. Now, he was somewhat worried about her, but he also knew she regularly had hangovers, and she clearly had one now, and so he figured, that's what this was. He also really wanted to leave right now and go meet up with his friend Sam to shoot up some more heroin, because that would take the edge off his headache and his nausea. However, before he could do that, he heard a weird sound coming out of the bathroom where Dawn was. At first, he wasn't even sure what it was, but then he realized it was a gurgling sound. And so at this point, he jumped to his feet and he hurried to the bathroom door, and as soon as he opened it, he gasped, because Dawn was laying there in the empty bathtub, fully clothed, and frothing at the mouth. Charlie had no idea what was happening, but he instinctively ran over to her, pulled her out of the tub, and he laid her on the floor, and he could tell that she was basically unconscious and she was limp. And in fact, when he listened closely to her mouth, he couldn't even tell if she was breathing. And so Charlie's thinking, this is not a hangover. This is something way more serious. So he ran and got a phone and he called the emergency line. And when the dispatcher picked up, Charlie frantically explained what was going on, that Dawn, his girlfriend, had just collapsed in the bathtub out of nowhere. The operator got his address and said they would send a paramedic, but they also told Charlie he would have to do CPR on Dawn while he waited, and so they explained to him how to do that over the phone. Charlie was horrified, but he tried to take a deep breath and do what they said so he could help Dawn, so he kept the phone by his side while he straddled Dawn and gave her chest compressions. It would take an agonizing 19 minutes before a single paramedic finally arrived. And by that time, Dawn had begun to turn blue. Charlie paced around anxiously inside of his apartment while the paramedic took over chest compressions. Charlie could hear the paramedic calling for more help on his radio. And sure enough, a few minutes later, more paramedics streamed inside. And at first, this made Charlie feel hopeful, like more medical support meant that Dawn was going to be okay here. But then, from his spot out in the living room, he heard one of the paramedics say something about drugs, like this could be an overdose or something. Charlie heard that and he called out that Dawn didn't do drugs, but the paramedics did not seem to hear him. And a second later, their voices got more urgent. They were using a lot of medical terminology that Charlie didn't understand, but he did catch one thing. Dawn's heart had apparently stopped. Now, the paramedics were actually able to get her heart beating again, but it took them more than an hour to get her stable enough to move her from Charlie's apartment to the hospital. And Charlie, he just watched in panic and despair as they loaded his girlfriend on a stretcher, and then he followed them out of the apartment to stay with Dawn for as long as he could. And then before they put her into the ambulance, he leaned in and he told her he would meet her at the hospital. As the ambulance doors closed and the sirens came on, Charlie's friend, Sam, appeared, looking very shocked by the commotion. They'd had plans to go to a church event that day that had free food, which Charlie had totally forgotten about. But Charlie told Sam everything that had happened and said he had to skip out on that event because he needed to go to the hospital as fast as he could to meet Dawn. But even as he was saying this out loud, he knew he really couldn't do that, because if he went to the hospital right now, he had no idea how long he'd be there. And since he was addicted to heroin, he would start to get sick from withdrawal if he didn't get some drugs in his system first. And so Charlie felt trapped. He really didn't know what to do here, and he sort of felt like he was on the verge of breaking down. This was just so much. But then he remembered he had a methadone prescription at the local pharmacy. Methadone is a drug that's often given to people who are addicted to heroin, who are, trying to get clean, and this drug is used to help them with addiction and withdrawal symptoms. It sort of closely mimics what the body would feel if it shot up the drug, but without, the euphoria and the actual high sensation of using the drug. Now, Charlie had not actually filled his methadone prescription yet, mostly because he was not focused on getting clean. But as he's thinking about needing to be at the hospital all day and needing to be, coherent and being able to talk to doctors and nurses and Dawn, he thought, well, hey, I'll go fill my methadone prescription. I'll take that. It'll keep me, from getting sick, but I'll also be clear-minded so I can be in the hospital and help Dawn. So Charlie asked Sam if he would come with him on a different outing to go to the pharmacy to get his methadone. A couple of hours later, at around 3:30 p.m., Charlie got back to his apartment with Sam. It had been incredibly hot outside, and walking around for that long, they now were both dripping with sweat. After they had gone to the pharmacy, Charlie and Sam had actually gone by that church event, but not really to get food, but instead to literally go say a prayer for Dawn. Now, they were back at his place to pack up a bag both for himself and also for Dawn that they would bring to her at the hospital, and then Charlie didn't really know how long he would be there, but he now had his methadone and figured he'd be okay. But as Charlie was doing this, it was like he couldn't think straight. He had this really intense headache, and even though it had been hot outside, it was like he just couldn't stop sweating. And so Charlie was thinking to himself, maybe it's the methadone. He had never done it before, and maybe this is like a byproduct. Maybe these are symptoms from taking methadone. So he decided he would just take a shower, thinking that would kind of, clear out these symptoms and he'd be back to normal. But after the shower, he felt even worse. And when he looked in the mirror, he saw his pupils were now constricted to little pinpricks. But he still tried to press on here, and he went into his room to get dressed and to finish packing Dawn's bag. But as just a couple of minutes went by, he noticed his heart began to race. And as it raced, it got faster and faster, like he couldn't calm it down. Now, over the past couple of days, between the methadone and heroin, Charlie had basically used a lot of drugs. But he did drugs all the time, and he'd never felt this combination of symptoms before. And so Charlie, he leaves the bedroom and he goes into the living room and he just sits down on the couch, feeling completely awful. And he has this thought come to him. He's thinking, okay, I don't think it's the drugs, because I always do drugs, and this is not it. I've never felt this way. And he looks over at Sam, his friend, and he has this weird thought that it's like, what if Sam poisoned me? What if that's what's going on here? What if I've been poisoned? And without really thinking through how or when this could have happened or why, Charlie began berating Sam, saying, "You poisoned me! Why did you do this to me?" And Sam was so caught off guard that he was like, "What are you talking about?" And he began backing away. And Charlie, he just jumped up off the couch and began to pursue Sam like he was going to attack him. But after only taking a couple of steps away from the couch, Charlie's mouth filled up with so much saliva that he stopped being able to speak clearly. All he could do was kind of gurgle and spit out this froth, and then his legs got so weak and wobbly that he had to lean against the wall just to keep from falling down. And then he felt his whole body begin to seize up, and then the last thing Charlie was aware of was his friend Sam grabbing a phone and calling for an ambulance. About an hour later, inside of the emergency room of the Salisbury District Hospital, the on-call doctor stood in Charlie Rowley's treatment room while a nurse at his bedside took his blood. The doctor had just finished examining Charlie, who was now unconscious. He'd clearly had a seizure, and now he had a fever. He had constricted pupils, and he had labored breathing. So clearly, to the doctor, Charlie's condition was very serious. But the doctor was sure he knew exactly what had caused it. Charlie had overdosed on drugs, and the doctor really felt strongly about this because Charlie's girlfriend, Dawn, had been treated that morning for the exact same thing. She'd been brought in after her heart stopped, and she'd had a lot of the same symptoms as Charlie. Now, they had stabilized her, but she'd been admitted to the intensive care unit and was still listed in critical condition. And so the doctor felt really confident in his diagnosis of both Dawn and Charlie because the symptoms fit. And the officer in charge of both cases had confirmed that Charlie, at least, was a known drug user, and the apartment where they'd both been found had been full of needles and other drug paraphernalia. Over the next 24 hours, neither Dawn nor Charlie got any better. In fact, they both got much worse. Their nervous systems began to completely break down, meaning that essential body functions like breathing were beginning to fail. Dawn was literally in a coma and being kept alive by a life support machine, and Charlie was also still unconscious, and his breathing had declined to the point where they had to put him on a ventilator. He'd also been moved to the intensive care unit, same as Dawn. And so at this point, Charlie and Dawn no longer looked like they had simply overdosed on drugs. It seemed like maybe they actually took a bad drug, like there was poison in the drugs they took perhaps, or something completely different. But none of the medical staff could figure out what was actually wrong. It was totally anomalous. By the afternoon of July 3rd, so 3 days after Dawn and Charlie were hospitalized, one of the doctors in the intensive care unit where they were, his name was Stephen Jukes, he had officially taken over both of their cases. Dr. Jukes had seen the results from the initial toxicology screenings, and they showed that while Charlie did have a significant amount of heroin and other drugs in his system, Dawn did not. All her results showed was that she'd taken some prescription psychiatric medication, and so Dr. Jukes had sent more of their blood to another lab to test for a wider range of drugs, so he was waiting on those results. But admittedly, he was losing faith that the results he was going to get would give him his answer. Now, by this point, Dr. Jukes had ruled out some things that could have caused their symptoms. Like at one point, they believed that, maybe the two had been exposed to a gas leak in Charlie's apartment, because some of the symptoms you get with the gas leak are similar to what they had. But the main reason this theory didn't really work out is, Dawn and Charlie had been in the apartment together that morning that Dawn was brought into the hospital, but only Dawn was affected. Charlie wasn't. And so presumably they were both being exposed at the same time to, if there was a gas leak. But then Charlie, he leaves the house for several hours, so he's out completely unexposed to whatever was in there. He comes back into the apartment, and then he feels sick. It didn't really add up. If he got sick from a gas leak in the apartment, it should have happened at the same time as Dawn. Also, the first responders, when they were in there working on Dawn, they didn't report smelling anything odd. Now, of course, some leaks like carbon monoxide, you wouldn't be able to smell that, but a typical gas leak, you would be able to smell. It smells like rotten eggs. Plus, you also have the fact that when Charlie got sick, Sam, his friend, was in the apartment as well, and he did not get sick. So, all told, the gas leak theory seemed to not be it. Dr. Jukes had also briefly wondered if maybe what had happened to Dawn and Charlie was connected to this strange toxin exposure case that had come through the hospital a couple of months earlier. However, the victims in that case were from out of the country, and Dawn and Charlie had not been out of England, so Dr. Jukes had ruled that out as well. But Dr. Jukes did have one theory he still thought was a good one. Maybe this was pesticide poisoning. It matched with their symptoms, and Dr. Jukes knew that sometimes street drugs can be contaminated with pesticides. So if Dawn and Charlie had both taken something that Dr. Jukes hadn't tested for yet, then they could have maybe been exposed that way. He had told the police about this theory, and so they'd issued a press release encouraging drug users to be extra cautious in case, there was this pesticide out there. But Dr. Jukes also knew that drugs were not the only way people could be exposed to pesticides. Simply eating, drinking, or breathing in contaminated food or water or air could be fatal. And this was extremely troubling to Dr. Jukes and to everybody else involved with the case. Because if Dawn and Charlie had been exposed to potentially deadly chemicals just by doing normal things in their home or neighborhood, that meant that basically everybody else in their neighborhood was also in danger of getting sick too. Now, until Dawn or Charlie woke up again, they were not going to be able to figure out, where they had been or what they had touched or ingested before they got sick. So Dr. Jukes felt like he needed to get that information from somewhere else, and fast. The next morning, July 4th, so 4 days after Dawn and Charlie got sick, Dr. Jukes pushed open a door to a room where Dawn's mother, her 3 sisters, and her son were all waiting. He'd heard they were all here visiting Dawn, and so he had had one of the nurses send them to one of these hospital family rooms so he could speak to them. He was hoping that they might be able to shed some light on where Dawn had been and what she might have eaten or drank before she got sick. Now, Dawn's family was staring at him with anxious expressions on their faces. He barely got out his introduction before they started lobbing questions at him about what was going on and why the news was describing Dawn as some kind of drug addict. Dr. Jukes just held up his hand to slow them down, and once they were quiet, he explained that at first they had believed this was an overdose because she had all the symptoms for it. But now, based on how the symptoms had progressed, he knew overdose was very likely not the case here. Then he told them his theory about the pesticides and said he really needed their help with it. He asked them to tell him everything they could about Dawn, her habits, her health history, and the people she typically saw. Dawn's mother said she had spoken to Dawn on the phone the night before all this started, and she said Dawn seemed fine. She had even asked to see her young daughter the next day at the big family get-together they were planning. Aside from that, though, the family said that, Dawn struggled with alcoholism and her mental health, and she didn't always tell them everything. And so they just didn't know much about Dawn's daily life with Charlie or her friends in Salisbury, although they were pretty sure that she rarely ever went outside of the city. But what the family primarily wanted to communicate to Dr. Jukes was that Dawn was not just some nobody the way the news had portrayed her. She was a loving mother and sister and daughter and friend, and she was really trying to do better, and she was doing better. She didn't want much. She just wanted a place of her own and a little more stability in her life, and that's the path she was on, and so they begged him not to give up on her. Dr. Jukes promised he would not, but as he left the room, he couldn't help but feel disappointed. He was glad to know more about Dawn as a person. She seemed wonderful, but he had been hoping for some kind of breakthrough about what exactly had happened to her, and he hadn't gotten that. None of them had been able to give him any answer that could maybe even begin to explain what was going on. And so at this point, he really wasn't sure what else he could even do. But as Dr. Jukes headed back towards his office to try to figure out his next move, he saw a lab tech rushing towards him down the hallway. The tech was holding a piece of paper, and when he reached Dr. Jukes, he shoved the paper into his hands. The tech was out of breath, but told Dr. Jukes he had to read this right now. So Dr. Jukes, he looked at the paper, and he saw that it was the lab results for Dawn and Charlie. And when he scanned its contents, he could not believe what he was reading. The new blood test that he had ordered did not confirm the presence of pesticides or of any other street drugs, but they did show something else, something so unexpected and so dangerous that Dr. Jukes now knew for certain that Dawn and Charlie were not the only ones at risk here. Everyone was, like literally everyone in Charlie's apartment building, everyone in Dawn and Charlie's neighborhood, all the paramedics, all the doctors, all the nurses that had treated them, and all the patients in the hospital. Literally everybody. In fact, it was even possible that everyone in the whole city was now in danger, and it might already be too late. And so Dr. Jukes sprinted down the hall towards his office, he picked up the phone, and he called the police. A few hours later, the deputy head of investigations for one of England's counter-terrorism units, Philip Murphy, stood on the street outside of Charlie's apartment building. His team had completely cordoned off the whole building and evacuated everybody who was inside. Dozens of officers and crime scene technicians were going in and out of the space wearing these big protective suits, and they were swabbing surfaces and collecting evidence. Because of those tests that Dr. Jukes had run, Murphy knew exactly what substance had sickened Dawn and Charlie, but he had no idea how they could have come in contact with it. And answering that question was now a matter of international security. Now, not only was Murphy's counterterrorism unit involved, but so were multiple other agencies, including the UK's Secret Service, which is known as MI5. MI5 would deal with the other countries outside of Europe that were now getting involved in this. In addition to Charlie's apartment, the counterterrorism unit had been deployed to the hospital and were making anyone who visited Dawn and Charlie now wear protective gear. They had contacted all the paramedics and all the officers who'd interacted with Dawn and Charlie and made them bag up their uniforms and equipment as biohazards. Some police officers were now sifting through literally thousands of hours of CCTV footage from all around the city from the past few weeks, looking for any signs of Dawn or Charlie. And others were contacting Dawn and Charlie's friends to try to get a sense of their recent movements. At least one friend had already taken officers on a tour of a park they'd all gone to the day before Dawn and Charlie got sick. Murphy actually had a team headed there right now to close it off and start taking more samples. He also had another team at Dawn's place doing the same thing. And so, as Murphy stood there watching the officers in suits go in and out of Charlie's apartment, he knew that really, as big as this was actually just the beginning. He was going to have to be patient, because even though the situation was clearly urgent, he also knew it could take a long time to figure out exactly what happened and why. And so at this point, all Murphy, or anybody else for that matter, could do here was just hope that, the authorities found some answers before more people got hurt. But just 4 days later, on July 8th, Dawn was taken off life support and died in the hospital. And of course, that was incredibly tragic. But specifically for Murphy, he was hoping to get a chance to speak to her. She was, a potential treasure trove of information about how this whole thing happened. And now, of course, he would never get that chance. On July 11th, so 11 days after Dawn and Charlie first got sick, with Dawn now deceased and Charlie alive but still unable to talk, the agencies working on the case had managed to eliminate almost every location that Dawn and Charlie had visited as the source of this toxic substance, except for one, and that was Charlie's apartment. And so Murphy sent the forensics team back to the apartment to search it all over again. That afternoon, a lead officer with the forensics team stood in the middle of Charlie's small apartment alongside some of his colleagues. This lead officer and his team were all dressed in these very heavy-duty protective suits, so they moved slowly around the cramped space as they took samples of surfaces and bagged potential evidence. All the stuff, all the clutter in the apartment made it really hard to get around. There were clothes on the floor and open bags of fabric and dirty dishes stacked in the sink and on the counters and overflowing trash cans. And in the bedroom, there was a bunch of makeup and some hair dye boxes scattered on the floor, along with needles and other drug paraphernalia. There was not a ton of furniture in the apartment, but it was all over the place because paramedics had pushed it around during their response. And other areas of the place were littered with medical debris, like rubber gloves and plastic wrappers. And there was also just some trash and just kind of like random objects, water bottles, plastic toys, piled up on the windowsills. It was almost like there was literally too much in the apartment to even effectively test it all. But as the lead officer walked around doing his best to, identify things to be tested, something on a counter caught his eye. It was an object that looked very different from anything else in the apartment. Now, to understand what happened to Dawn and Charlie, you have to go back in time to 3.5 months before they got sick, when an unrelated older man and a younger woman were found unresponsive on a park bench in Salisbury and brought to the Salisbury District Hospital, the same one that Dawn and Charlie would go to. Now, this older man and the young woman, when they came into the hospital, they were experiencing seizures and they couldn't stop vomiting. But after being treated at the hospital, they actually both fully recovered. And at first, the doctors there, including Dr. Jukes, thought this man and woman were just regular civilians who had gotten sick, maybe from an overdose. But soon, it became clear that both of those things were not true. Number one, they were not just regular civilians. The older man was a Russian spy who had defected to England, and the young woman was his daughter. And they had definitely not overdosed. They had been poisoned. An investigation discovered that the substance that had been used to poison them was this very rare and deadly chemical weapon created by Russia called Novichok, a kind of nerve agent. And so 3.5 months later, after Dawn and Charlie were hospitalized and getting worse and worse, and then that lab tech rushed down the hallway to show Dr. Jukes their new lab results, it was Novichok, the deadly chemical that Dr. Jukes saw printed on the paper. That was in their system. Investigators in the spy poisoning case had never been able to figure out exactly how the poison had been administered to the spy and his daughter. But the item that Murphy's forensics team had found on the counter in Charlie's apartment, the one that kind of stood out and didn't really appear like it belonged in this space, was the item that ultimately solved that mystery. It would turn out Charlie actually found the source of the poison, unintentionally. It was that brand new bottle of perfume that he had given to Dawn on the morning they both got sick. Because Charlie hadn't actually bought this gift at a store, he couldn't have afforded it. Instead, he had found it in a dumpster during one of his many dumpster diving excursions. And that dumpster just so happened to be the exact same dumpster where a Russian agent had discarded the poison perfume after the attempted assassination. So when Dawn accepted Charlie's gift and sprayed it on her wrists in excitement, she had accidentally exposed herself and Charlie to the deadly nerve agent. Charlie would eventually recover from his exposure to Novichok. As for the 3 Russian agents that authorities suspect were involved in this thing, they went back to Russia and have never been prosecuted, and Russia has denied involvement in the poisoning. On a muggy Saturday night on June 7, 1986, 29-year-old Kathy Lipscomb parked her car in front of an apartment complex in San Antonio, Texas, and reached into her purse for a tube of lipstick. Kathy tilted the rearview mirror toward her face and touched up her lips. And as she looked at her reflection and swept her platinum bangs to the side of her forehead, she almost didn't recognize herself. There was a glow on her face that she hadn't seen in a long time, not since she'd been a newlywed. These days, the happy parts of Kathy's marriage felt very far in the past. Over the last 8 years, she and her husband had had 2 children, who they both loved deeply. But Kathy had come to feel increasingly trapped in her life, until just about a month ago when she and her husband had finally agreed to separate. To Kathy, that decision felt like it gave her back her freedom, and she knew that who she was seeing now in the rearview mirror of her brand new car was a brand new woman. Kathy grabbed her purse from the passenger seat, got out of the car, and walked towards the large apartment building up ahead. And suddenly, she felt really nervous. But it was the good kind of nervous. She had butterflies in her stomach because she was on the way to spend the night with her new boyfriend, who she had fallen completely in love with. Kathy's soon-to-be ex-husband had the kids, and for at least a little while, Kathy could put all her worries out of her mind. So she walked up 2 flights of stairs to the 3rd floor of the building and then rang the doorbell of her boyfriend's apartment. Kathy heard footsteps drawing closer, and then the door opened up, and Kathy beamed at the man standing there. The man grabbed Kathy and kissed her, led her inside, and shut the door behind them. The next evening, Kathy's soon-to-be ex-husband, 30-year-old Air Force Master Sergeant Bill Lipscomb, buckled their 4-year-old son and 7-year-old daughter into the backseat of his car and began driving to the other side of town, where Kathy had just moved into her own apartment. Kathy was supposed to pick the kids up from Bill's house, but she hadn't shown up and she wasn't answering her phone. So now, Bill was driving the kids to her. When they got to Kathy's building, Bill knocked on the front door of Kathy's unit, which was on the ground floor, and he and the kids waited there in silence. When she didn't answer the door, Bill knocked again. But still, there was no answer. He turned to his kids and tried to smile because he didn't want to upset them, but he knew this was actually really weird. Kathy was never even late picking up their kids, so the idea that she just would blow it off entirely and then also not be home made no sense. Bill told the kids to wait at the door, and then he walked back to his car. He got a notepad, a pen, and a roll of tape out of the glove box and walked back to the building. Bill wrote a note stating that he and the kids were there at 6:45 and would try again later. Then he stuck that note to Kathy's front door. Then he looked down at the kids and asked them if they wanted to write their mom a note too. The little girl nodded and took the pen from her dad and scribbled onto the pad, and Bill tore out the page and stuck that to the door as well. The note read in large block letters, "Mommy, we love you." A day later, at around 9:30 a.m. on Monday morning, a woman working at a university health clinic named Sarah Bowers had a question for Kathy Lipscomb, who was one of the nurses that she worked with. So Sarah walked over to Kathy's office. But when she stepped inside, it was empty, and Sarah saw that a bunch of pink "while you were out" memos had piled up on Kathy's desk. Sarah walked in and picked up one of the messages and read it. It was from Kathy's husband, Bill. He had called in an hour earlier looking for his wife. And this, coupled with the stack of other notes that were very similar, gave Sarah a bad feeling in the pit of her stomach. Because Kathy was one of the most reliable nurses in the clinic. Like, where had she gone? Why hadn't she called in? Sarah picked up the phone and dialed Kathy's apartment number. She knew it because she and Kathy were actually friends outside of work. But the call just rang without an answer, and Sarah eventually hung up and returned to her desk. But over the next hour, Sarah could barely focus because all she could think about was Kathy. She kept looking up at the clock on the wall, watching the minutes tick by, hoping to see her friend walk into the office with a totally reasonable explanation for why she was late. Or even without an explanation. It didn't matter, so long as Sarah knew Kathy was okay. By the time the clock struck 10 that morning and Kathy still had not shown up to work, Sarah could not stand it any longer. She got up and walked directly to the office of her and Kathy's boss, Dr. David Pearl. When Dr. Pearl saw Sarah standing at his door with a troubled look on her face, he asked her what was wrong. Sarah told him that Kathy was 2 hours late to work, and she was not answering her phone. And based on the notes on her desk that were piling up, her husband had also not heard from her either. At this, Dr. Pearl furrowed his brow. Kathy hadn't mentioned anything to him about being late or absent that day. It made him concerned that she might be sick, or maybe even injured, and couldn't get to the phone. So he asked Sarah to drive over to Kathy's apartment to check on her. Sarah sped over to Kathy's apartment, which was only about 10 minutes away. When she got there, she found the notes on the door and she knocked, but there was no answer. And so feeling kind of desperate, she ran to get the building manager and begged the woman to let her into her friend's apartment. Now, the manager knew this was against company policy to do this, but she could see how upset Sarah was, so she unlocked Kathy's door and let Sarah go inside. And what Sarah found inside sent her panic through the roof. The apartment was perfectly neat and tidy. It didn't look like anything bad had happened here, but there was no sign of Kathy. In fact, it looked like she had not been home for days. At around the same time, about 15 miles away, an airman who worked at the local Air Force Base was driving to work down a 2-lane road outside of town when he noticed something lying in the grass on the side of the road. The airman pulled over to the shoulder and got out of his car to investigate. He walked off the road and into the grass and stared down into the weeds in utter disbelief. When he got over the initial shock, he ran back to his car, drove to the nearest house, and called the police. It took police officers from the Bexar County Sheriff's Office just a few minutes to arrive at the spot on the road where the airman had made his discovery. It was a strange location for a 911 call. The area was pretty much deserted, and this road was basically only used by Air Force personnel who drove in and out of the base. The police got out of their cruiser and walked to the side of the road into some spiky grass, and just a few feet in, they stopped. For a minute, they just stood there together in silence, looking down. Because there, lying in the weeds below, they saw the dead body of what looked like a teenage girl. She was naked and covered with ants, and they saw thin trails of blood on the sides of her mouth. But as horrifying as all of that was, the officers were actually much more fixated on something else. The girl's body was contorted. Her legs were bent at the knee, and her ankles were crossed, as if she had been sitting crisscross style. Her torso had been folded forward, so her chest was resting on her legs, and there was some kind of fabric under her foot. The officers had been to enough crime scenes to know that this girl's body had not just been tossed out of a car quickly by a person trying to get rid of evidence. Instead, her body had been carefully posed, like whoever killed her wanted her to be found. That afternoon, homicide investigator Sergeant Sal Marin sat in his office at the sheriff's station trying to ID the victim that police had just found on the side of the road. Marin had started off pretty confident that he would be able to figure out who it was pretty quickly. From the looks of things, the victim appeared to be a teenager, and she had been healthy, well cared for, and well groomed. In other words, she looked like she probably had a family who would definitely report her missing right away. But so far, Marin had not been able to find any missing persons reports that matched her description, and he thought that was strange. Just then, a secretary came by and dropped off the medical examiner's report from the autopsy along with the crime scene report. Marin grabbed the medical examiner's report first, and as soon as he opened it, he grimaced. The victim had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death, most likely on Sunday night, so one day before she was found. Her body appeared to have been posed soon after her death, before rigor mortis had set in, which is the stiffening of the body after death. And to Marin, this felt off. Usually, when young women were murdered, the killer was someone they knew, either a partner, friend, or a family member who acted out of rage or jealousy. Sadly, it wasn't unusual to see sexual assault or strangulation in cases like this, but it was extremely unusual to see such deliberate posing of the body. Killers who know their victims often try to cover them up, not display them. Posing a body was evidence of a careful and deliberate killer, acting with a plan. It was something that sadists and serial killers did, and it made Marin think that his killer was likely a stranger to the victim. And that was bad news, because killings by strangers were among the hardest to solve. The suspect pool was enormous, because the killer could be anyone. But as Marin continued through the report, he spotted what he thought might be his first clue. 4 strands of long red hair that were found on the girl's body. The girl was a blonde, which meant the red hairs could have come from her killer. The medical examiner had examined these hairs under a microscope, and they found they had been dyed red and they had no roots. And Marin wasn't sure what to make of this. The hair could be from a wig, or they could be from a woman's head, but Marin found it highly unlikely that his killer was female. He put the autopsy report down and picked up the crime scene report, and here, Marin found his second clue. The victim's clothing, which was a pair of Levi's jeans and a t-shirt, had been placed underneath her right foot by the killer, and what Marin noticed was the clothing had been rolled up rather than folded. Marin picked up a pen and wrote down the word military in the margins. Marin knew that people in the military were trained to roll up their clothes instead of folding them, because it was more compact and efficient. And the girl's body had been found on a road used almost exclusively by members of the Air Force. But before Marin got too deep into his theories on the killer, his first priority was to find the dead girl's identity. Only then would he be able to begin retracing her last moments and figuring out who she had contact with in her final days. So, over the next hour, he began reaching out to local radio and TV stations, asking producers to broadcast news of the crime every half hour, with a description of the young victim. He got the story placement at the top of the afternoon news. Later, at 5 p.m., when still no tips had come in, Marin was getting ready to leave and grab something to eat, but just as he was standing up from his desk, his office door swung open and a deputy handed him a single piece of paper. It was a missing persons report for a woman named Kathy Lipscomb. Her family had just called to report that no one had seen or heard from her since Saturday. And the second Marin started reading the report, he felt a rush of adrenaline. Kathy was petite, blonde, and had gone missing right around the time the medical examiner believed his victim had been killed. Marin thought Kathy might be his victim. But then his eyes settled on Kathy's age, and he felt his excitement drain away. Kathy was 29 years old, almost 30, but the dead woman found on the side of the road looked a full decade younger than that, at least, so Kathy didn't seem to be a match for his homicide victim. Still, Marin wondered if this missing persons report about Kathy Lipscomb was a different kind of clue in his case, because based on Kathy's physical description, it was eerie how similar the two women were. Marin felt his appetite vanish, and he sat back down at his desk. He was starting to fear that he could have a serial killer on his hands, who was hunting petite blonde women, and that Kathy could actually be his second victim. A few hours later, Sergeant Marin's efforts to get the description of his victim blasted out onto the airwaves paid off. By this point, Marin was at home on his couch watching TV when his phone rang. He walked into the kitchen and picked it up. It was the medical examiner's office calling to tell him that a woman watching the news had heard about the discovery of the body and realized that the description of the young victim matched a friend of hers perfectly. At first, this woman had not wanted to believe it, so she actually had gone to her friend's apartment to check on her. But when her friend did not answer the door, the woman had called the police. and the police directed this woman to the medical examiner's office where she would positively identify the body. Marin's victim finally had a name. When Marin heard the name, he immediately turned to the coffee maker on his counter and started brewing a pot. He was going to have to go straight back to work. Because Marin did not have 2 victims on his hands, he had just one. The dead body of the girl by the side of the road and the missing Kathy Lipscomb were one and the same. Kathy, despite being 29 years old, was just unusually young-looking. This meant that Marin's theory of the case, that he might be dealing with a serial killer, had become a bit more unlikely. He still viewed the posing of the body as evidence that the killer was a stranger to the victim, acting on a calculated plan rather than a sudden burst of emotion. But he was down to just one victim. And now that his victim did have an identity, Marin had to do the part of his job that he hated the most, and that was to tell his victim's family about the murder. About an hour later, Marin met Kathy's husband, Bill Lipscomb, at the sheriff's station. Marin was aware that Bill was a decorated member of the Air Force, and that he was very young to be a master sergeant, which was a pretty high rank. So Marin knew that the smartest way to approach Bill was to be formal and polite, rather than aggressive, even though divorce was a classic motive for murder, and Bill was a natural suspect. So, in the interview room, Marin reached out and shook Bill's hand and told him he was very sorry about his wife. He promised to do everything he could to bring her killer to justice. But while Marin was giving Bill his condolences, he was also looking Bill over very carefully, visually checking his arms, his hands, and his face for any signs of injury, like bruises, scratches, or fingernail marks that might be evidence of a recent struggle. But, except for the fact that Bill was pale and sweating, he appeared to be physically unharmed. Marin opened up his notepad and asked Bill where he was over the weekend when Kathy had gone missing. Bill said he had been with his and Kathy's children since Friday afternoon. He said they didn't do much, just kind of hung around the house. Bill said Marin could talk to the kids, and they would tell him the same thing. Marin nodded, and then asked Bill how long Kathy had been living in her new apartment. When Bill sighed at the question, Marin looked up from his pad. He was surprised to see that Bill almost looked angry. Bill shook his head and told Marin that Kathy had only been in the new place for about a week or so, but the neighborhood it was in had been a point of contention between them. He said he'd warned Kathy it was a bad area. He didn't like the seedy bars and strip joints all over the place, but Kathy had refused to listen to him. The apartment was close to her work, and she told him it was not his business anyway. Bill shook his head again and looked down at the table, and Marin could tell that clearly the separation between Bill and Kathy was still pretty raw. He told Bill he had just one more question, and then he'd let Bill go home to his kids. Marin explained to Bill that based on the location where Kathy's body was found, and the way her clothes were rolled up, not folded, he thought there could be a military connection. He asked Bill if any of his fellow airmen might have had a problem with Kathy, or if one of Bill's subordinates could have been angry at him. And with this question, Bill went from looking upset at Kathy to looking upset at Marin. He said no, absolutely not. His friends at the Air Force all loved Kathy, and he got along great with the people he worked with, regardless of rank. He didn't have any enemies, and no one he knew could have done anything like this. Marin sat back studying Bill. He could tell Bill was worn out and getting frustrated, but he didn't find that particularly suspicious, given the circumstances. Marin decided that the best move was just to tell Bill to go home. It was late, and he'd get better interviews in the morning. The next morning, Sergeant Marin interviewed Bill and Kathy's 2 young kids, and they confirmed their father's story. They had been with their dad all weekend, just like he'd said. So Marin decided he had to start from square one. First, he decided to interview Kathy's neighbors to see if anyone had spotted a person lurking outside her apartment. If the killer was a stranger to Kathy, like Marin suspected, then they would likely have found her by simply running into her somewhere, and it was possible they might have followed her home. And right away, when he started to canvass, he got a tip and a surprise. Because one of Kathy's neighbors told him that on the day Kathy's body was found, he saw a suspicious person walk up to Kathy's door and then just lurk there for a few minutes before walking away. And the neighbor said this person was a woman, not a man, which was not what Marin was expecting. When he asked the neighbor for a physical description of this woman, the neighbor paused and thought for a second, saying he hadn't gotten a very good look. But then his eyes lit up as he remembered one crucial detail. The suspicious woman had long, red hair, just like the 4 strands of long red hair the medical examiner had found on the victim's body. Sergeant Marin spent the next couple of days talking to Kathy's family, friends, and coworkers, probing for any information about a red-haired woman in Kathy's orbit. But not one single person had any idea who that could be. Instead, Kathy's friends and family had a different idea for a suspect: Kathy's new boyfriend. Kathy had only been dating this man for a few weeks, but she was already saying she was madly in love with him. But some of her friends thought the boyfriend was bad news. The first reason for this was because he was married. The boyfriend kept telling Kathy that he and his wife were separating and would be divorced soon, and although Kathy believed him, none of her friends did. This boyfriend also had a reputation for sleeping around and promising every woman he was with that he was going to leave his wife for them. In fact, he was known for keeping a bachelor pad apartment where he could entertain his various girlfriends without his wife's knowledge. And another reason Kathy's friends didn't like her boyfriend was even simpler. It was because he was her boss. Kathy's boyfriend's name was Dr. David Pearl. It was Dr. Pearl who, on the Monday that Kathy failed to show up for work, sent her coworker Sarah to Kathy's house to check on her. Kathy's friends knew she had been spending time with Dr. Pearl when she didn't have the kids with her, and that caught Marin's attention, because the kids had been with their father on Saturday night, which, as far as police knew, was the last time anyone had seen Kathy alive. Marin wanted to know if Kathy had gone to meet Dr. Pearl that night. And so, a few days into his investigation, Marin found himself putting the red-haired woman on the back burner for a new number 1 suspect: Kathy's boss and boyfriend, Dr. Pearl. Almost a week after Kathy was murdered, Marin sat at his desk in police headquarters, making a list of possible scenarios while he waited for uniformed officers to bring Dr. Pearl in to be interviewed. He thought maybe Kathy had been pushing Dr. Pearl to get a divorce. Maybe Kathy threatened to tell his wife. Or maybe, Marin thought, the doctor's wife had already found out about the affair and taken revenge on Kathy. Marin sat back at his desk and wondered if the suspicious red-haired woman who had been seen at Kathy's apartment the day her body was found could be Dr. Pearl's wife. Just then, a uniformed officer knocked on Marin's door to tell him that Dr. Pearl was waiting for him. Marin stood up and followed the officer back to the little interview room where Dr. Pearl was sitting, looking perfectly calm and in control. When Marin walked in, Dr. Pearl immediately reached out and shook his hand. And then before Marin could ask even one question, the doctor began telling him how shocked he was by Kathy's death. The doctor said it just didn't make any sense, because he had just seen Kathy a day or two before she died, and she had seemed totally fine. Marin nodded, being careful to keep his facial expression neutral. When Dr. Pearl was done saying how sorry he was for Kathy, Marin looked down at his pad and asked, in a very deliberate voice, where and when exactly had the doctor last seen Kathy. And at this, the doctor went silent. Marin knew it was clear from his tone that he already knew where and when Dr. Pearl had last seen Kathy, like he knew about the affair, and it was obvious. But what Marin was doing with this question was testing how this very smooth suspect reacted to a little bit of pressure. Dr. Pearl stared at Marin for a few seconds with a polite but completely blank expression on his face, and after a tense moment, the doctor gave an apologetic smile and said, "I'm sorry, but I'm going to need to speak to my lawyer." On Saturday, June 15th, so a week after Kathy had been murdered, Marin was at home, taking a day off to try to clear his head. This case had felt like trying to put together pieces from 3 different puzzles into one coherent picture. None of the clues made sense together. The posing of the body suggested a methodical killer who did not know the victim. But Marin's best suspect was Kathy's boyfriend. The rolled-up clothes suggested the killer had a military background, and Kathy's soon-to-be ex-husband was a member of the Air Force. But he had a rock-solid alibi, and none of his friends or colleagues had any real link to Kathy. The sexual assault suggested that the killer was a man, but the long red hairs on the body and the suspicious red-haired woman at Kathy's door were evidence that there was a female involved. And beyond all these contradictions, there was very little in the way of actual physical evidence to tie any suspect at all to the murder scene. So when Dr. Pearl had lawyered up during his interview, Marin had had no choice but to let him walk out of police headquarters without charging him. And since then, the only thing he'd learned was that Dr. Pearl's wife did not have red hair and had never been to Kathy's apartment. Just then, Marin heard his phone ring and he hopped up. He hoped it was someone calling to tell him there had been a new break in the case, just like the last time he got a call at home. But when he answered, it was just more bad news. A crime scene tech told him that Kathy's car had been found in the parking lot of a restaurant a mile from her apartment. Forensic investigators had searched it for fingerprints, but they came up empty. Someone had wiped it clean. Over the next few weeks, every lead Marin tried to chase went nowhere. And slowly, newer homicide cases started to pile up, and they began to take up more and more of Marin's time. Marin did return to Kathy's case every few weeks, hoping he'd spot something he missed. But no matter how many times he read the different reports, nothing in them made any more sense than it had in the beginning. A month or two into the investigation, Kathy's mother had called Marin, and he promised her he would make sure that Kathy's murder was not forgotten. But as the months piled up, the case just got colder. By the 1-year anniversary of Kathy's death, the only thing Marin knew for sure was that whoever killed Kathy had not killed again, at least not in the area of Bexar County. There had been no other murders reported, with the posing of the body, or the long red hairs, or the rolled-up clothing. By the 2-year anniversary of Kathy's death, Marin had begun to dread the calls from Kathy's family, because the only thing he had to offer them were apologies. It was not until late 1988, so more than 2 years after Kathy was murdered, that all the blurry pieces of evidence finally snapped into focus. And it happened because Kathy's family hired a private investigator. When this PI heard about the initial handling of the case and the huge mistake made in thinking that the body of Kathy Lipscomb was that of a teenage girl, he decided to start the investigation all over again. And in doing so, he discovered a critical piece of evidence that somehow the police had missed. That evidence was Kathy's datebook. In this datebook, Kathy had written cryptic notes about something called the WAPS test. The PI didn't know what a WAPS test was, but apparently, someone Kathy knew had all the answers to this test and was passing them around. To the PI, this sounded like Kathy knew something about some kind of cheating scandal. Not like adultery, like actual cheating on a test. But the PI wondered who in Kathy's orbit would be taking a standardized test. It didn't make sense for anyone at Kathy's job, which was at a medical office. On a hunch, the PI called the nearby Air Force Base, and that's when he realized he was holding the link that completed the chain of evidence, and broke the case wide open. Now, the PI worked with the Air Force as well as Sergeant Marin to bring in a man who had, until the discovery of the datebook, flown completely under the radar. His name was Clint Richards, and he had worked with Kathy's soon-to-be ex-husband, Bill Lipscomb, in the Air Force. And when investigators brought Clint in to talk, he told them everything. Based on Clint's story and evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Kathy Lipscomb on the night of June 8, 1986. That night, the killer sat patiently inside of their home on their couch, waiting for Kathy to arrive. They'd been expecting her. And when the killer heard knocking, they walked across the room, put a smile on their face, and opened their front door. There was Kathy, exactly on time as usual. The killer gestured for her to come inside, and she stepped over the threshold while the killer shut the door behind her. As soon as Kathy looked around the room, she realized something was wrong. It was too quiet. But the killer was expecting this. When Kathy turned to confront them, the killer pushed her to the ground and raped her. Then they grabbed an electrical cord they had hidden nearby, climbed on top of Kathy, and wrapped it around her neck. As they pulled, Kathy tried to fight back, but after several minutes, it was too much and she stopped moving. After Kathy was dead, the killer stood up, crossed the room, and opened a cedar chest. Then they dragged Kathy's limp body across the floor, they folded her at the waist, picked her up, and jammed her inside of the chest, crossing her legs so she'd fit. Once the chest was closed, the killer called a friend. A few hours later, the killer and the friend carried the cedar chest with Kathy's body inside out of the killer's apartment and loaded it into the friend's vehicle. Then, the killer handed the friend 4 strands of long red hair and walked back inside of their house. The friend drove off with Kathy's body and the hair. After a few minutes, the friend turned their car onto a deserted 2-lane road outside of town. They pulled over, removed Kathy's body from the chest, and carefully placed her on the ground on the shoulder of the road. Then, the friends set about staging the scene to look as if the killer had posed Kathy's body on purpose. They rolled up Kathy's clothing and placed it underneath her right foot, and then they laid the 4 long red hairs on top of Kathy's body. Finally, when the scene was perfect, the friend got back into their car and drove home. With Kathy's death, both the killer and the friend were now certain that no one would ever know that the killer had cheated on the promotional exam that the Air Force called the Weighted Airman Promotion Systems Test, or as everybody called it for short, the WAPS test. The friend who dumped the body was Clint Richards, and the killer was Kathy's soon-to-be ex-husband, Bill Lipscomb. It was Bill, the young master sergeant who had moved up the Air Force ranks with shocking speed, who had cheated on the WAPS test. Kathy knew about it, and she had threatened to expose him during their divorce because she wanted Bill to give her full custody of the children. It would turn out that Marin had been correct in his assessment that Kathy's killer had acted with a plan and had deliberately posed her body. But he had been wrong about why. Bill and Clint had worked together to stage the crime scene to make it look like a murder committed by a sadistic rapist. Those long red hairs were part of that staging, meant to throw the police off. And they had worked even better than either Bill or Clint had expected. And this was because of a chain of events that police themselves had set in motion in their early efforts to identify the body found on the side of the road, when they believed the victim was significantly younger than she was. Police had put the description of the victim out to the media, and a friend of Kathy's had heard it. That friend had been the one to make the identification of Kathy's body, but she only did so after going to Kathy's apartment to check on her. The suspicious red-headed woman the neighbor had seen was actually just Kathy's friend. It was a total coincidence, but it had confused investigators for years. Meanwhile, Bill had escaped suspicion with his alibi because he had told his young children to lie to the police about being with him all night. Bill had preemptively suggested to Marin that Marin should talk to his kids because he knew they would lie for him. It was only when the PI began poking around on the case that Bill's 9-year-old daughter finally found the courage to tell the truth. She had not been with her dad the night her mom was killed. Instead, her dad's friend, Clint Richards, had taken her and her brother out for dinner. That was why, when Kathy arrived at Bill's house right on time to pick up her kids like she always was, she found the house too quiet and realized her kids were not there. When Kathy turned around to confront Bill, he raped and killed her. Clint Richards avoided prosecution for cooperating with authorities. As for Bill Lipscomb, he pled guilty to Kathy's murder in order to avoid the death penalty, and he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. However, he was granted an early release in May of 2021. Our next story is called Random. In 2019, Meg Moorer was a 21-year-old senior at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana. She was studying ecology and evolutionary biology and planned to pursue a career in scientific illustration after graduation. This was a field that combined her skill as a scientist, her incredible artistic ability, and her general love of nature. But despite her intellectual brilliance, what Meg was actually known for was her very uplifting personality. When her mother was asked what her daughter was like, she said, "Well, it's like trying to describe what it's like to feel the warmth of the sun. There are not words to accurately describe what that feels like." And that was Meg. She was radiant, she was joyous, she was adventuresome, she was kind, she was really just a wonderful person to be around. In March of that year, just 2 months before their graduation, Meg and 2 of her close friends decided to go on a trip for spring break. This would be their last spring break as students, and they wanted to enjoy it. Because they were all in excellent physical condition, they decided they would spend the week hiking in Georgia. When Meg told her family about her big plans, they could tell she was extremely excited, and they just told her, be safe and we'll see you when you get back. On the morning of their departure, which was March 5th, Meg packed her suitcase into the trunk of her small green sedan, and then she drove over to her two friends' apartment building, and they came out and they put their suitcases into the car, and then once the car was all packed and all three of them were inside, they hit the road. The drive from Tulane University to this area in Georgia where they'd be hiking took about 8 hours if you didn't stop. But none of them were in a particularly big rush, and so they figured they would just stop along the way, and if they got to Georgia super late at night, so be it. After being on the road for 2 hours without stopping, they all needed to use the bathroom, and so Meg decided to pull over at the first rest stop she saw. And the first one she saw was in this residential town in Mississippi called Gaucher. So she pulls off the highway into this very nondescript rest stop, and all three of them get out. They go into the main building and they use the restroom. Meg was the first one to be done, so she came outside and she waited right near the bathroom door. And then her two friends, they finished up as well. They came out, and then the trio began walking back towards the parking lot where Meg's car was. At the same time, a man driving an 18-wheeler tractor-trailer truck was bombing down the highway right outside of this rest stop, and right before he was going to pass the area where this rest stop was, he heard something fall off the back of his truck. He instinctively checked both of his mirrors to see if maybe he could see what had fallen off, but he didn't see anything in the road, and so he just pulled over onto the shoulder and got out to see what was going on. When he walked towards the back of his truck, he expected to see, maybe one of the back doors had popped open or something like that. But even before he made it to the back of his truck and could even look at those back doors, he already knew what had fallen off the truck. 2 of his back tires were just gone. This truck had what's called dual rear wheels, which meant on the axle, there was not just one wheel on each side. Instead, there were 2 wheels on each side. So 4 wheels across one axle. And so each of these 2 wheels were bolted together and would turn at the same time and kind of functioned like one big fat tire. This gave the truck more stability and safety when it was towing. The driver, in a panic, looked back down the road in the direction he had just come, hoping to just see the tires somewhere, but they weren't anywhere to be found. And so, not really knowing what to do, he just instinctively called his boss and told him what was going on. And his boss just said, "Hold tight, I will send help out to you." And so this driver is left to just stand on the side of the road and wait for help to arrive. And so as he's doing that, he's just staring back down the road in the direction he had just come, as if these tires are just going to magically appear. And as he's looking in this direction, he starts to notice on the other side of the highway, there are police cars and ambulances streaming into a rest stop that he had just passed. And it was the rest stop where Meg and her 2 friends had been. It would turn out when these 2 tires became dislodged from this truck, they went careening across the highway to the other side, across oncoming traffic, all the way up into this rest stop, and they crashed directly into Meg right as she was climbing back into her car. These 2 tires combined weighed almost 1,000 pounds, and so the impact killed Meg. She was pronounced dead on the scene. After an investigation, it was not conclusively determined what actually caused these tires to fall off. The likely cause was they were missing a small part known as a locking washer that costs $3 and is very easy to acquire. But regardless, at this point, the incident is considered a freak accident. The next and final story of today's episode is called Goosebumps. In 2006, a 20-year-old woman named Sarah started having some very strange dreams about a woman named Aurora. She had a very striking face with sharp features and long black hair. Now, her dreams varied. Sometimes Sarah was in a crowd of people, or she was at her office, or she was just alone in a room. But in all of her dreams, Aurora would always show up. Either she would interact with Aurora and they would speak, but Sarah could never remember what they actually spoke about, or Aurora would just be in the crowd or in the background just watching Sarah. Now, she had these dreams enough that eventually Sarah began to think, I must know someone named Aurora. I must have come across this person, and now they're just kind of manifesting in my brain at night when I'm sleeping. And so she began going through her older posts on social media to look in pictures of her and of her friends to see if there was a woman with striking features and long black hair that was this Aurora person in her dream. But after looking through hundreds and hundreds of pictures, she couldn't find any indication that she had met this person, at least not according to her social media. And so Sarah began just going on Google and typing in, "Aurora, long black hair, striking features. Has anybody dreamed about this?" to see if there were people talking about having this type of dream on the internet. But she had no luck. Eventually, after about 3 or 4 months of having these strange dreams that Aurora was in, Aurora stopped showing up in Sarah's dreams. It was like it suddenly was all over. And so very quickly, Sarah just kind of forgot about it. A few years later, on Halloween night 2009, Sarah and a friend pulled off the highway into a gas station. They had been out with some friends celebrating Halloween, and now they were making their way back home. Sarah pulled into an empty spot right in front of the convenience store, and after they were parked, Sarah and her friend got out, they went inside, they got some snacks and drinks, and then they came back outside and climbed back into Sarah's car. A few moments later, Sarah had turned her car on, she had backed out, and she had driven past all of the gas station pumps, and she was making her way towards the single-lane strip of road that merged out onto the highway. It was how anybody who got into this gas station got back out onto the highway. And so as she's getting closer to the entrance of this short merge road, her phone suddenly rings. What happens next occurred over a span of just a few seconds. So it might seem like this is over several minutes, but this all happened pretty much simultaneously. So she's pulling up to the entrance of this merge road, her cell phone rings, and because there was no one behind her, it was not a busy night, Sarah decides to just stop her car, put it in park so she can safely take this phone call. And so she stops her car pretty much right in front of the entrance to this merge road, and she picks up her phone, she looks at the number, and she doesn't recognize it, but she picks it up anyways, and she says, "Hello." There was silence on her phone, and as Sarah is saying, "Hello, is anybody there?" another car from the gas station pulls up right behind Sarah's car, and they start honking their horn immediately. They're in a huge rush. And so Sarah, who's totally embarrassed that she's blocking traffic, she hangs up the phone, she puts it down, she puts her car back in drive, and she hits the gas. But this driver behind her is apparently in such a rush, they're so impatient, that they actually swerved around her, driving on the dirt off to the side of the road just to get around her, and then they sped off down the merge road back onto the highway. And literally, seconds later, another car that was already on the highway, a silver Honda Civic, lost control and smashed into this car that had just passed Sarah's car. So there's this huge car accident literally right in front of Sarah and her friend, who have now stopped the car. They're right at the end of the merge road looking at this horrible accident that they narrowly escaped. Sarah put her car back in park, she picked up her phone, and she called the police. When the police showed up a few moments later, they took down Sarah and her friend's version of events, and then a little while later, after the ambulances had left and after the 2 cars had been pulled off of the highway, one of the police officers pulled Sarah aside and told her that the driver of the Honda Civic and the driver of the car that had swerved around her had both been killed in the accident. Shocked, the only thing Sarah could think to do was to call back that number she didn't recognize that had effectively stopped her from getting onto the highway and maybe even stopped her from being hit by that Honda Civic. And so she wanted to talk to this person and thank them for saving her life. But when she called the number back, the person did not pick up. However, it went to her voicemail, and it said, "Hi, you've reached Aurora. Leave your name and number after the beep." Sarah could not believe it. She said she had never felt goosebumps like that in her entire life. The next day, Sarah tried calling the number again, and this time the woman, Aurora, answered the phone. The two got to talking, and Sarah explained her crazy dreams and now this crazy car crash thing and how it's all connected. And Aurora would tell Sarah, like, "That's amazing. This is a crazy story you're telling me, except I didn't call you last night. I have no idea how you got my phone number." And so at the end of this phone call, the two women really had not reached any sort of explanation for how this came to be, how they came to be talking. But they ultimately just said, "Okay, hey, thanks and best of luck to you," and then they hung up. After the call was over, Sarah found herself just kind of sitting there, not really sure how to react to what had just happened. It was such a totally bizarre thing that she had just been through over the past 24 hours. And then if you include the dream, this has been a multi-year-long thing. And so on a whim, Sarah just opens up her Facebook account and she plugs in Aurora's full name because Aurora had given her her full name on this phone call they had just had. And when she looked at her phone, when the results came in, Sarah nearly fainted. Right at the top of the results page was this woman, Aurora's Facebook account, and her profile picture showed her face. And when Sarah looked at her face, it was the exact same face she had seen so many times in her dreams. It was the same Aurora with the striking features and long black hair. The woman in her dreams was the woman who called her and saved her life.
In the blue light, 2 a.m. again. I count the seconds loading just to hear you say my name. We talking low battery, promises on mute. I fall asleep with your voice still echoing through. I trace your shadow on a glass screen. You're so close, but no one.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you like today's story and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all our studio's podcasts. They are this one, the MrBallen podcast. We also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios